Je vous souhaite la bienvenue à la quatrième conférence dans la série de conférenciers du Réseau en théorie internationale. Hello, I welcome you all to what is our fourth talk in the International Theory Networks conference series. Today we are very fortunate to have Michael Williams, who is from our very own Graduate School in Public and International Affairs. He has, of course, a long and extensive list of accomplishments. His most recent book, written along with his wife Rita Abrahamsen, is Security Beyond the State, which just came out in 2011. He also has other works such as Culture and Security, and his work on the realist tradition in international relations theory as well. He's picking up some of those themes, I believe, today in his talk. And without further ado, I'll pass it along to him. So I want you to all welcome Michael Williams.
Thanks, Kevin, and thank you, everyone, for coming out on this beautiful, balmy Ottawa summer's day. The talk I'm going to give today has a slightly strange history, so I want to actually talk a little bit about that before I actually talk about the history that I'm going to talk about. It comes out of an invitation to contribute to a special issue of the journal, the European Journal of International Relations, which has the working title, The End of IR Theory, ? i.e., is IR theory over? Which clearly, given that we're all in an IR theory network here today, is a question of some interest to all of us, since this may be the last event we ever have, if the question is answered affirmatively, and in fact IR theory is over, and people like me need to look for something else to do for a living. I don't want so much to answer that question today, as I do want to use it, as I do in this paper, as a launching pad for thinking about international relations, both as a field and as a structure of theoretical debate. Because the really interesting thing about asking the end question isn't whether or not you can find out something is ending, or when it might have ended, or if it could end, or any of those kind of questions. For me, a really interesting question about asking about endings is it allows you to rethink what it is that you think you're doing. Because if something isn't at an end, you have to be able to ask, well, what the hell was it? And if you ask what it was, then you can ask, well, where did it begin? And I want to use that puzzle. When did international relations begin? And what was or is it? To come up with what I hope are some fairly heretical answers to those questions. This is a talk that I've given a couple of times. For reasons that I don't understand, it really seems to get on people's nerves. Maybe that's just me. Maybe there's something in here that I just don't see. Maybe it's because, well, to be honest with you, it comes in a nice version, and it comes in a version that's really designed to offend people. And I never really make up my mind which version I'm going to give until basically now. So why don't I give the offending version and see how that one goes, and see if it outrages people here. I hope not, as much as it has outraged some other people in other places. And the argument is this, that if we think seriously about IR theory ending and beginning, what we will discover is that most of the foundational categories that we think international relations theory is about are in fact profoundly wrong. I want to argue that the basic theoretical distinction that guides much of debate in international relations, and indeed that guides the narratives through which we think about the evolution of the discipline, is fundamentally misconstrued and in error. And that error, I want to argue, is this wonderful distinction between realism and liberalism. Now, if we think about disciplinary history, all disciplines have their narratives. We all know that all narratives are at some level arbitrary. Narratives tell us where we began, where we are, and where we are going, presumably. In international relations, the almost unavoidable narrative is the narrative of the great debates, right? Kevin, maybe, where are you? There you go. Maybe you're different than most people in the discipline of international relations, but when you teach international relations theory to your first-year students, do you teach the great debates?
Realism and idealism.
Excellent. The great debate. How many people in here have been taught the great debates as the history of international relations? Right? This is how we tell the story of this field. And the story, of course, goes something like this. Circa, hard to tell, maybe 1912, maybe 1919, these terrible things called liberal idealists pop up and begin to run the world, okay, or begin to try to run the world. And they are comprised, sorry about this, David, largely of lawyers, international lawyers, moral philosophers, and above all, liberals. And effectively what they do is screw the world up for 20 years, culminating in the Second World War, when shortly before, despite the valiant efforts of a small group of thinkers called realists, liberalism leads us down the road to ruin, and thankfully, post-World War II, realism comes to be the dominant theory of international relations, having won the first great debate and having proven its victory via war. Okay. There are two problems with this narrative, I think. The first one, as a lot of great disciplinary history has shown over the last decade, is that if you look for the first great debate in the 1930s, you can't find it. It doesn't actually happen. The first great debate actually takes place in the 1950s and is retrospectively cast onto the 1930s, largely by the winners, realists. Idealists disappear. Why? Well, because they were actually never really there in the first place. Right? That's one story. Brian Schmidt up at Carleton, a whole bunch of some wonderful things to say about this. It's not the argument that I want to make today. The argument that I want to make today is that to believe that the origins of international relations lie in the fundamental battle between realism and liberalism is wrong. Realism is liberalism. In fact, realism in international relations was an attempt to save liberalism from itself. This is what international relations was. It was from its very inception not primarily an intellectual project, it was a political project. And if we believe that realists were the implacable adversaries of liberals, if we believe that realism is antithetical to liberalism, as continues to structure debate in the academic world and indeed outside of it, then we are fundamentally wrong. This is the point at which some people begin to get a bit agitated with me. So now I clearly have to actually demonstrate why I think this is the case, given that I proceeded to tell them that the fundamental way in which they think about the field is misconceived. To do this, I want to go back through the history of international relations. And I want to ask, when did international relations theory begin? And I want to give a very specific answer. Now, there are a wide variety of answers to this question, right? Some people say international relations theory began with Thucydides. Some people even say it began with the pre-Socratics, Others like Machiavelli. Some others, they kind of go a little small sect out there, thinks Augustine is a really cool place to start, right? Other people like 1648, Westphalia. Other people like 1789, blah, blah, blah. Take your choice and you pull a narrative out of it. The narrative I want to argue is much, much more specific. International relations theory, I want to argue, following the wonderful work of Nicolas Guillot, began in 1954. It began in a very specific place called New York City. And it began as a specific political, philosophical project. As Guillot has shown in some really wonderful intellectual history, in 1954, Kenneth Thompson was the director of research at the Rockefeller Brothers Foundation, arguably the most powerful think tank funding organization in American foreign policy at that particular point in time, brought together a series of luminaries who studied world politics. Amongst them, Hans Morgenthau, Reinhold Niebuhr, Walter Lippmann, George Kennan, a variety of others, with the goal of developing some specific body of thought called international relations theory that could be the foundation for a separate discipline called international relations. Question: why? One answer, the standard answer, is that international relations needed to free itself from the suzerainty of diplomatic history and international law. To some extent, I think that is true. It comes up with a better answer. Answer is this: that international relations was founded in reaction to the rise of American politics, particularly to the rise of American rationalist politics, i.e., the kind of political science that is dominant in the United States, and indeed in much of North America, and indeed is spreading across the world at this very point. International relations as a field, as Guillot puts it in a wonderful line, was born as an act of intellectual irredentism, a declaration of independence from rationalist political science. He argues that this was largely an intellectual move. I want to argue that it was largely a political move. That the goal was not simply philosophical. That the goal was to provide a foundation for liberalism that rationalist political science could not provide. In this way, the birth of international relations was part, I would argue, of a broader movement in political studies that Ira Katznelson, in his wonderful book Desolation and Enlightenment, has called the Political Studies Enlightenment. Katznelson argues that the political studies Enlightenment, the early 1950s, has been almost largely written out of the history of political science. But his argument is that at this particular point in time, a very diverse group of thinkers, Robert Dahl, Harold Lasswell, Karl Polanyi, Hannah Arendt, Richard Hofstadter, the historian of American politics, all revolve around a discernibly similar set of concerns. And that set of concerns was the crisis of liberal modernity and the inability of prevailing conceptions of liberalism to actually ground a liberal politics. It was only by understanding the limits of the Enlightenment, by understanding the limits of pre-war liberal politics, these thinkers argued, that the Enlightenment as a political and philosophical project could be saved, and that liberalism as a set of political and institutional practices could be saved, quite literally saved from themselves. Their key puzzle was twofold. On the one hand, to try to understand how it was that the most enlightened, progressive, and in many ways liberal societies in the history of the world to that time, i.e. European states, had ended up becoming involved in some of the most barbaric, illiberal, and counter-Enlightenment kinds of practices, and policies. And secondly, crucially, to understand how the United States did not fall prey to these dynamics. The task, therefore, was twofold. On the one hand, it was philosophical, and on the other hand, it was sociological. Philosophically, the members of the political studies Enlightenment argued that political theory had to take much, much more seriously the problems of what Nicholas Renger has called the politics of darkness. Not enlightenment, but darkness. Most specifically, it had to take seriously the problem of evil. For the Enlightenment, evil throws back to the bad old days, right? Theological concepts, bad moral thinking. For the political studies Enlightenment, it was only by an engagement with the particularly interesting and powerful forms of modern evil that one could understand modern politics. As Hannah Arendt put it in a very famous letter that she wrote to Karl Jaspers, evil has proven more radical than expected. Okay. Arendt was not somebody who believed in an evil human nature. She was somebody who thought that evil was a profound part of the human condition and that one needed to think it through, and that it was precisely this that Enlightenment liberalism had become incapable of doing. So, on the one hand, it was necessary to engage with the politics of darkness. On the other hand, sociologically, it was necessary to engage with the way in which modern politics had become transformed in ways that rendered classical liberalism simply unrealistic. Here I think there were at least three categories. The first was the rise and domination of instrumental rationality, instrumental reason, the way in which reason, far from being simply a tool for the liberation of humanity, had also become a tool for its domination and indeed its destruction. Concentration camps being a classic illustration. Secondly, the way in which the modern state had become a power unto itself in ways inconceivable for classical liberalism. And finally, the way in which all politics were now mass politics. That is, that any realistic conception of political representation, of political action, now had to take seriously the phenomenon of mass politics. In terms of all three of these, they can be crystallized basically into taking a look at Leni Riefenstahl's wonderful films of Hitler at Nuremberg. They all play through that trope. Okay. If this is what the political studies Enlightenment was up to, I want to argue that it's exactly what international relations in its genesis was up to. Indeed, so much so that even though there isn't a single international relations thinker in Katznelson's pantheon of the political studies Enlightenment, I would argue that the resemblances are so strong that in fact it makes sense to call something called the international relations Enlightenment. And I think we can see this across three of its crucial figures. Hans Morgenthau, Reinhold Niebuhr, and John Hertz. Sort of what for many people are the unholy or holy trinity of post-war realists. How did this play out? First, if we take a look at classical realism in this period, its fundamental political concern is with the crisis of liberal pluralism. It is with the crisis of the idea that self-interest or even group interests can provide a foundation for a liberal polity. The philosophical and theoretical lineages here are long. They go back to Max Weber, but they find their most extraordinarily intense expression in the thinking of Carl Schmitt and in his argument that parliamentary democracy could not sustain itself. That parliamentary democracy was in fact an historically passé form of government. This is an argument that above all the people who are talking about Morgenthau was most intimately familiar, having met Schmitt, having famously written that he considered him to be the most evil man alive, having been a Jew and having to flee the country under policies that were at least in part influenced by Schmitt's legal philosophy and its ability to become translated into German state policy. And in a recognition, mediated largely through Hans Kelsen, that in the problems of liberal conceptions of law, a realist politics found its most intense expression. That is, that only a liberalism that could meet and master Schmitt's critique could in fact be a realistic liberal politics. The goal, therefore, was not to destroy liberalism, but to provide it with new foundations. Realism in this form was not simply a theory of international politics, it was most profoundly a theory of politics as a whole, and particularly of domestic politics. In a very different setting, Reinhold Niebuhr engaged in precisely the same war, quite literally, intellectually in his case, with American pragmatism. His famous conflicts with John Dewey over whether that most American of political philosophies, pragmatism, could actually provide a foundation for a liberal politics, were driven by Niebuhr's conviction that it couldn't, and therefore that one needed a new realistic form of liberal politics. Evil as a political category. Of all the post-war realists, Niebuhr, being a theologian, was the one most comfortable with evil. Evil and the human capacity for evil, and particularly the meaning of evil in modern societies dominated by instrumental reason and mass politics, for him, were not some throwback to a vaguely sulfurous kind of vision of politics. They were absolutely essential to any meaningfully realistic theory of politics. For Morgenthau, too, evil was not some atavistic vision of human nature that somehow arises in my chest and makes me want to rip poor Kevin's throat out because I feel like it. Right? Evil was in fact a crucial category of political theology. And the most persuasive, certainly the most powerful and influential theorist of political theology in the Weimar Republic was none other than our old friend Carl Schmitt, who argued famously in his book Political Theology that all modern political concepts are essentially theological concepts, and that no proper understanding of politics that did not contain evil could in fact be a proper theory of politics. All, as Schmitt famously put it in that book, adequate conceptions of politics, he takes us back to our old friend Thomas Hobbes, place evil at their center. Instrumentality, the rise of science, the dominance of instrumental reason over our thinking, was, I think, best expressed by John Hertz in his analysis of the meaning of the atomic age. How was it that human beings had not only conceived the technical capacity to destroy the entire species, but could, in fact, for anybody who's looked at immediately post-war nuclear strategy could systematically think about the most efficient means for doing so. That, after all, was what American nuclear strategy from 1949 through roughly 1955 was all about. How did you most efficiently obliterate as much of the planet as you possibly could? For Hertz, this was not simply a technical question. It was a philosophical puzzle. How had human societies come to a point where this not only seemed rational, but where this seemed to be something that one lauded in terms of figuring out its precise modalities? Herman Kahn, the model for Dr. Strangelove in the wonderful movie, is the preeminent illustration. All three of these theorists were also interested in the way that nationalism had become, in their eyes, transformed from a liberating philosophy of the 19th century, and maybe even of the early 20th century, to the kind of destructive, crusading mass nationalism that they believed was at the heart of the crisis of the politics in the 1930s, and indeed the crisis of the Second World War and after. Nationalism, in other words, had been transformed by both the crisis of liberalism and by the rise of mass politics. And any understanding of it had to take that into account. One way of reading this legacy, then, is to see it largely as a tale of despair. Realists, after all, are good at despair. Arguably, it's the thing they're best at. It is what Ned Lebow is famously called the tragic vision of politics. To be a realism is not generally, at least in philosophical terms, to be a happy, sunny type. Right? Realists are happiest in the shadows, in the darkness. And indeed, many people today believe that that's what realism is. It's to be a kind of shadow dweller, grumpy, not very nice. I don't think so. And I would argue neither did the theorists of the IR Enlightenment. Because one of the most fascinating and overlooked elements of their thinking is exactly the one that you find in Katznelson's political studies Enlightenment. That is a fascination with the United States, and particularly with American republicanism, small r, republicanism, as a mode of trying to mediate liberal politics. Thus, if one looks over Niebuhr's long career, his argument is always that somehow the genius of the American Republic, however screwed up it may have become over the past 200 years, was its ability to move beyond classical liberalism and precisely the kinds of problems that somebody like Schmidt pointed to. Morgenthau's, what I would argue, second most interesting book, his most interesting book is Scientific Man versus Power Politics, which is, of course, a critique of instrumentality. His second most interesting book is one that virtually nobody reads anymore. In fact, until I was skulking around a library one afternoon, I didn't even know it existed. It's called The Purpose of American Politics. And it is, basically, an Arendtian anthem to the American Republic, its potentials, and its failings. In other words, realism attempted to generate what we might today, for all of its problems, call a liberal republicanism. In many ways, for those people who are interested in contemporary intellectual history, the person who perhaps comes closest is Quentin Skinner, and his desire to fuse republicanism and liberalism. That's a different story. In sum, the story of international relations is not the story of a desire for a realistic politics in terms of description alone. It is not the desire for realism as a form of empiricism or positivism. Some people who I otherwise respect enormously have fallen into the standard mantra of saying the history of international relations, well, things were kind of going good in the 30s. We had some interesting ideas. There was E.H. Carr. There was all that stuff, right? It was nice. And then all of a sudden, Hans Morgenthau and the Americans come along in the 1950s and impose positivism on all of this. And it's all gone to hell ever since. And this is the great story of critical theory and IR, right? The rebellion against positivism. It's a good story. It's a good narrative. The problem is it ain't true. If one is a critical IR theorist, the closest intellectual bedfellows that you will find are in the realists of the early 1950s. They are the people who actually understood critical theory. And one of the great paradoxes of contemporary international relations discourse is that they are the people who are the defining enemies of critical theory. Thus, the whole discourse of international political theory is screwed up from its foundation. Secondly, a similar confusion confronts the relationship between liberalism and international relations. And realism in international relations. Realism never sought simply to destroy liberalism. It sought, most definitely, to attack vociferously and often viciously those forms of liberalism which it thought were naively destructive of liberalism itself. But its purpose, unlike reactionary modernism or reactionary conservatism in the late 1930s, right through the late 1950s, was not to destroy liberalism, but to try to refound it in order to save it, philosophically, sociologically, and empirically. Realism, then, was not simply a philosophy of international politics. It is a theory of politics writ large, one that sees the domestic as important as the international, one that sees the sociological as crucial, and one that sees the philosophical as crucial. In other words, realism is everything that people now claim it is not. That's all true historically, I think. What's its significance today? I want to argue threefold. The first, I think, follows from what I just said, which is that if a discipline is to think about its future, and indeed about its present, it has to be clear about its past. I think international relations is one of those fields that has been remarkably unclear about its past. But if we really think about what it is and where it came from, we find that that clarity becomes productive in a contemporary sense rather than simply reductive in a historical sense. Secondly, and more practically, I would argue that the question of the viability of a liberal politics is once again absolutely at the center of debate in American foreign policy. If we look at the activities of, to use what are today the basic standard bearers for American liberalism, John Eikenberry, Anne-Marie Slaughter, their project on American foreign policy, run out of the Wilson School at Princeton, we find the argument that American liberalism, the future of the liberal world order, is once again in crisis, and it needs to be put right. Their adversaries in this, self-declared adversaries, are, of course, none other than the realists, represented, somebody who was through here not 2 months ago now, by people like John Mearsheimer. Eikenberry argues for a new liberal grand strategy. Mearsheimer argues that a liberal grand strategy is a contradiction in terms, that no liberal is capable of thinking grand strategically. Each talks past each other, because they believe that they literally have nothing to say to each other. Why? Because their discourse has already been structured by a set of divisions that make it possible in the first place. Dissolve those divisions, and you actually get an engagement. And an engagement, I would argue, is precisely what we need. And we need it, I think, at this time more than ever, because one of the crucial concerns for realists, particularly in the context of the United States, was whether or not the United States was capable of even having a foreign policy. Realists these days are generally considered people who take the state as actor for granted and foreign policy as its problem. The realists that I'm talking about didn't. They saw the generation of collective action within a liberal polity as one of the crucial problems of modern politics. In other words, you had to try to create a society, quite literally, that was capable of exercising a reasonable and, in their view, realistic foreign policy. That demanded an engagement with domestic politics and with the problems of pluralism, the strengths and the challenges of pluralism. If one takes a look at many of the speeches made by Obama over the last couple of weeks, it's not hard to see that this problem is central to American foreign policy today. One of the key challenges is the United States capable of acting as a collective unit any longer? That is a problem that I would argue is central to contemporary foreign policy. I would argue it is a problem which classical realists would have found absolutely comprehensible. And finally, I would argue that it was a problem that they would have brought to intellectual resources that considerably transcend those that are on offer in contemporary American international relations theory. Thus, if international relations theory is not to be at an end, which I don't think it should be, I would argue it can benefit by resuscitating its beginnings. And its beginnings, I believe, lie in what I call the international relations enlightenment.